Throughout history, the ideas that truly changed the world weren't the ones that comforted us. They were the ones that made us uncomfortable. It's the unsettling, controversial thoughts that tear through the fabric of normality and expose the hidden structures of reality. These are the ideas that shake empires, bring down dogmas, and force awareness to wake up. Saying things like, truth can be a form of violence, or freedom is a disguised prison, isn't just philosophical play. It's a direct challenge to common sense, inherited morality, and established institutions. And because of that, it's also an act of courage. From Socrates, condemned for corrupting the youth, to Nietzsche, who exposed the false idols of reason and morality. From Hannah Arendt, who found evil in blind obedience, to Foucault, who uncovered the invisible workings of power. The history of critical thought is a history of confronting what's already in place. This video brings together 100 philosophical statements that break the comfortable silence of ready-made truths. 100 ideas that don't ask for permission to exist. They arrive as dangerous questions, piercing certainties, shaking convictions. Some shock, others hurt. Many set us free. Each phrase, idea, and thought isn't just theory. It's a cracked mirror that forces us to think off track and maybe even against ourselves. Because in the end, there's only one kind of thought that's truly authentic, the one that dares to be controversial, and therefore has the power to spark transformation. Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most provocative philosophers of the 19th century, coined the phrase "God is dead" to describe a major shift in Western society. This statement isn't meant to be taken literally, but as a metaphor for the decline of traditional religious influence on everyday life and moral values. With the rise of science and rational thinking, religious explanations for the world lost ground, leading to a crisis of meaning and values. Nietzsche saw this death as both an opportunity and a challenge. Without divine guidance, individuals are now responsible for creating their own values and purpose. This freedom is empowering, but it also means we must face the responsibility of filling the void left by the absence of a higher moral authority. Nietzsche warned of the danger of nihilism, where the lack of meaning could lead to hopelessness and inaction. For him, the answer was the idea of the Übermensch, or overman, someone who rises above conventional morality and creates their own path. This person doesn't cling to absolute truths, but embraces life in all its uncertainty and struggle. In this way, God is dead becomes a call to action, an invitation for us to take ownership of our lives, question societal norms, and find authenticity in our choices and beliefs. Nietzsche urges us to become the architects of our own destiny, creating meaning that reflects our unique individuality and lived experience. Friedrich Nietzsche challenged traditional ideas about morality, arguing that moral values are not universal truths, but social constructs shaped by history and culture. He saw morality as a useful illusion, a tool developed to maintain social order and help people live together peacefully. According to Nietzsche, traditional morality often suppresses natural human instincts, labeling them as good or evil based on arbitrary rules. This can lead us to internalize values that don't truly reflect who we are or what we deeply want. He proposed a revaluation of all values, encouraging people to critically examine moral norms and redefine them. By doing this, we can free ourselves from imposed beliefs and live according to our own nature and will. Nietzsche wasn't calling for chaos or a complete lack of values. Instead, he envisioned a morality that grows from authenticity and self-empowerment. When we recognize morality as a human invention, we can take responsibility for our actions and values, leading more meaningful and genuine lives. Thomas Hobbes, a 17th century English philosopher, coined the phrase, "Man is a wolf to man," to express his view of human nature in its rawest form. He argued that without a strong central authority, humans would constantly be in conflict with one another, driven by self-interest and the desire for power and resources. Hobbes described this condition as the state of nature, where no laws or institutions exist to regulate human behavior. In such a state, Everyone acts solely based on personal needs, resulting in a war of all against all. Life, he said, would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. To escape this chaos, Hobbes proposed the idea of a social contract, a mutual agreement where people give up some freedom in exchange for safety and order. This leads to the creation of the state, an authority capable of enforcing laws and maintaining peace. Though Hobbes had a rather grim view of human nature, his philosophy highlights the importance of political and social structures in keeping our worst impulses in check and making civilized life possible. Karl Marx, the German philosopher and economist, famously said, "Religion is the opium of the people," suggesting that religion acts like a drug, numbing pain and offering comfort to the working class in the face of hardship. He believed religion was used by the ruling classes to maintain control, distracting people from the social and economic injustices they faced. Marx argued that religion promises rewards in the afterlife, encouraging people to accept suffering now rather than seek real change. In this sense, religion can be seen as a tool for preserving inequality, not fighting it. However, Marx also recognized that religion is a real expression of human suffering. In a world full of inequality and struggle, it's natural for people to turn to faith for meaning and hope. So, Marx's critique wasn't just about religion itself, it was about how religion functions in society. He believed that by addressing the root causes of suffering, people wouldn't need religious consolation anymore and could face reality more directly and actively. When Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote this line at the start of The Social Contract, he wasn't just making a bold observation, he was throwing down a challenge. To Rousseau, freedom isn't something granted by the state, it's something natural, part of being human. And yet, everywhere he looked, he saw people trapped by authoritarian governments, deep inequalities, and institutions that oppressed rather than liberated. Rousseau believed that in the state of nature, humans were free and guided by basic needs and compassion. But as society developed, with private property, competition, and vanity, people became entangled in structures that restricted their freedom. These chains weren't just political, but also moral and social. Rules, customs, and expectations that shaped behavior at the cost of authenticity. But Rousseau didn't think this loss of freedom was inevitable. He proposed a new kind of social contract, where people give up total freedom for a shared civil freedom, one based on the general will, not domination. This contract would prioritize collective good over individual power, not oppression, by a few, but democratic self-rule. Rousseau's vision was of a society where politics expressed freedom, not control. His famous line is still a call to reflect. Are we living true to ourselves, or have we simply accepted the invisible chains around us? Nietzsche doesn't mince words when discussing the state. By calling it the coldest of all monsters, he highlights something deeper than mere bureaucracy or institutional impersonality. He points to a machine that pretends to be the voice of the people, but often feeds on individual freedom, creativity, and human authenticity. To him, the modern state presents itself as necessary, rational, almost paternal. It promises security, order, and progress. But behind this civilized appearance, Nietzsche sees a voracious entity that swallows individuals' uniqueness in the name of a supposed collectivity. He compares it to a monster not just for rhetorical effect, but because the state, in its coldest form, demands obedience in exchange for protection, a pact that often turns citizens into mere cogs in the machine. Nietzsche also criticizes the illusion that the state is morally neutral. For him, it appropriates the language of justice and law to legitimize its authority, but deep down, it's driven by interests of domination and control. This coldness comes precisely from the fact that it speaks on behalf of everyone, but disconnects from each individual's real needs. His warning is clear. The more individuals transfer their autonomy to the state, the more they distance themselves from themselves. Nietzsche's resistance isn't a call to chaos, but a defense of inner freedom. In a world dominated by rules and structures, He suggests preserving the creative spark that resides in each human being, even if the price is the unease of thinking for oneself. When Simone de Beauvoir asserts that existence precedes essence, she's deconstructing centuries of thought that upheld a fixed idea, that there's a natural, eternal, and immutable essence to being human. Contrary to this, de Beauvoir proposes a new way of thinking about the subject. We aren't something predetermined, we become. This view breaks with the metaphysical tradition that separated body and soul, nature and culture. For her, the body is the starting point from which experiences unfold and identities are formed. It's in the flesh, in social and historical relationships, that being is constituted. Saying that existence comes before essence means there's no biological destiny that defines what a person is. What defines someone are their choices, actions, and experiences. Essence, in this sense, isn't given. It's constructed over time. This assertion is deeply existentialist. We are freedom in action, even in the face of contexts that try to imprison us. The impact of this idea goes far beyond philosophy. It has influenced social movements, gender debates, and the struggle for equality. De Beauvoir invites each person to break with narratives that impose limits. The body can be the starting point, but not the prison. The human being, for her, is a project, a possibility, a becoming. Thus, instead of accepting a predefined role, we are called to create ourselves. And this is both a burden and a freedom, because being free means having no excuses not to be. When Gilbert Ryle states that the soul does not exist, he's not denying the existence of the mind or emotions. What he challenges is a deeply rooted idea in philosophical tradition, that the human being is composed of two distinct elements, body and soul. He calls this the myth of the ghost in the machine. According to Ryle, this dualistic conception, mainly inherited from Descartes, creates a confusion that there's a separate self inhabiting the body and commanding its actions. For him, this image is misleading. The mind isn't a hidden, immaterial substance concealed within the flesh, thinking, deciding, remembering, feeling. All these are ways of acting, forms of behavior that manifest in the world, not mysterious phenomena occurring in some invisible interior. The mind, for Ryle, isn't something we have, but something we do. When someone solves a problem or expresses affection, they're not revealing an internal ghost, but acting in an observable manner. This approach breaks with a long metaphysical tradition, moving toward a more practical, linguistic, almost behavioral philosophy. The central point is that seeking the soul as an isolated entity is a category mistake, like trying to find the number 3 inside an apple. The mind isn't a thing among other things, it's a way of being in the world. And this shift in perspective invites us to view humans not as hidden enigmas, but as a set of meaningful actions. Instead of seeking what we are inside, perhaps we should pay more attention to what we do. There perhaps lies what we truly are. When Arthur Schopenhauer said, "The world is a representation," he meant that what we experience as reality is actually shaped by our minds. We don't see the world exactly as it is. We see it through a filter. Everything we touch, hear, see, or feel is processed and interpreted by our brains. So, in a way, we're not living in the world itself, but in our version of it. This idea was inspired by Immanuel Kant, but Schopenhauer took it further. He believed that behind everything we perceive, behind the colors, shapes, and sounds, there is something deeper, something we can't fully grasp, the will. According to him, the will is a blind, driving force at the core of all existence. It's what pushes us to act, to want, to strive, and yes, often to suffer. So life, in his view, has two sides. The first is the world as we experience it, our personal representation of reality. The second is the will, this unconscious energy that fuels all life. but also creates endless desire and dissatisfaction. Schopenhauer's view can feel a bit dark. He believed that much of human suffering comes from this constant craving, the will that never lets us rest. But he also believed that there were moments when we could rise above it. Through art, especially music, or through deep contemplation, we might step out of that cycle for a little while and find peace. In short, Schopenhauer reminds us, reality isn't just out there, it's shaped from within. The way we see the world says as much about us as it does about the world itself. And by understanding this, we might learn to suffer a little less and live a little more consciously. Michel Foucault challenged one of the most comfortable assumptions in Western thought, that truth is something fixed, objective, and eternal. For Foucault, truth isn't discovered, it's created, and it's created through language, power, and history. When he says that truth is a construct of language, he's saying that what we call truth in any society depends on how we talk about it, on the words we use, the rules we follow, and the institutions that back certain stories while silencing others. In other words, truth isn't just about facts. It's about who gets to define them. Foucault argued that every historical period has its own regimes of truth, ways of thinking that become dominant not because they're more accurate, but because they've been legitimized by authorities like science, law, religion, or the media. Language, in this sense, isn't neutral. It shapes what we see, what we think is possible, and what we even notice. This idea might sound relativistic at first, but Foucault wasn't saying that all claims are equally valid. What he was doing was calling us to be more critical, to ask, who benefits from this version of the truth? Who gets excluded? What voices are being ignored? He believed that by understanding how truth is produced, not just accepted, we can become more aware of the power dynamics in our society. That awareness, in turn, gives us the tools to resist manipulation and create space for alternative perspectives to be heard. In the end, Foucault's message is a call to responsibility. If truth isn't fixed, if it's shaped by language and power, then we all play a role in shaping the world we live in, through what we say, what we believe, and what we choose to question. Michel Foucault breaks away from the idea that moral values come from pure reason or eternal principles. For him, what a society sees as moral is deeply connected to the power structures that shape it. Morality doesn't come from the human, heart, or some higher ethics. It emerges from how power operates in our language, our institutions, and even our bodies. Instead of seeing power as something centralized, like a king or government authority, Foucault shows that power seeps into everyday life. It's in the doctor's office, the classroom, the prison, the rules we follow, and even the words we use to describe things. Because of this, what counts as good or bad shifts, depending on who's in control. What's praised in one culture might be punished in another. Morality, then, isn't fixed. It's flexible. And often, it serves to keep some groups in charge while silencing or excluding others. Foucault isn't trying to say what's right or wrong. He's showing how those ideas are built. That doesn't mean everything is equally valid, but it does mean we should question how moral rules are made. Who benefits? Who loses? Instead of blindly accepting what we're told is good, Foucault wants us to ask who's really pulling the strings. In the opening of the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels deliver a powerful and poetic line: "All that is solid melts into air." They weren't just describing a feeling of instability, they were capturing the restless, ever-changing nature of capitalism. Nothing stays the same. No tradition is sacred. Everything is absorbed, reshaped, and discarded. Under capitalism, old values, family ties, and religious beliefs lose their weight. What really matters becomes profit, growth, and innovation. Human relationships get replaced by contracts, numbers, and transactions. The past fades, and the future always feels uncertain, like we're building our lives on shifting sand. This constant change creates amazing technology, Yes, but also deep inequality. Modern life promises endless possibilities, but often delivers anxiety and disconnection. What used to feel solid becomes temporary. Even personal identity can feel like it's slipping away. But Marx and Engels weren't just being pessimistic. They also saw this chaos as a chance. If everything can be broken down, then everything can also be rebuilt. That's the spark of revolution. Realizing that nothing is permanent means we can create something better. A world where people matter more than profits. A world that puts humans, not money, at the center of life. For Marx, history isn't just a timeline of kings, wars, and inventions. It's a story of conflict, mainly between those who have power and those who don't. Between the people who own the means of production and those who only have their labor to offer. This changes how we look at the past. Marx believed that economic systems shape everything. Our governments, our values, even our morals. For example, the shift from feudalism to capitalism wasn't just about technology or politics. It was about changing who held power and how society was structured. To Marx, conflict isn't a mistake. It's the engine that drives history forward. Landowners versus peasants, bosses versus workers, the ruling class versus the working class. Every major shift in history, he said, came from these deep social tensions finally reaching a breaking point. This way of thinking forces us to question inequality. Poverty, privilege, and exploitation aren't just how things are. They're the result of specific systems and choices. And because they're human-made, they can be changed. Class struggle isn't just a theory, it's a call to action. Marx believed that once people understand the forces shaping their lives, they can organize, fight back, and build something better. History isn't just something we study, it's something we make. Baruch Spinoza, a 17th century philosopher, shook the foundations of how we think about freedom. He claimed that free will, the idea that we can choose freely, independently of any outside influence, is an illusion. According to Spinoza, people believe they're free simply because they don't understand what's really driving them. We think we're making choices on our own, but in reality, our actions are shaped by a chain of causes. Our desires, our biology, our environment, and the natural laws that govern everything. Just like a rock doesn't choose to fall when it's dropped, we don't choose our decisions out of thin air. They're part of a bigger system of cause and effect. That might sound depressing, like we're all just passengers in our own lives. But Spinoza offers a deeper kind of freedom. Not freedom from causes, but freedom through understanding. The more we understand what shapes us, the more we can live in harmony with our true nature. To Spinoza, real freedom isn't about doing whatever we want. It's about becoming more self-aware, knowing why we feel the way we feel, why we react the way we do. And once we have that awareness, we can stop being pushed around by random emotions or external pressures. In the end, Spinoza gives us a calm, powerful kind of wisdom. Freedom comes from knowledge, not control. And that kind of freedom is deeper than any illusion of choice. Friedrich Nietzsche loved shaking up the things people thought were certain. When he said, "There are no facts, only interpretations," he wasn't denying that reality exists. What he was challenging is how we understand and talk about it. For Nietzsche, nothing comes to us in a pure form. Everything we see, judge, and believe is already shaped by our perspective. By the words we use, the culture we grew up in, our personal experiences, and even our desires. That's why what one person sees as a fact, someone else might see completely differently. Think of history, science, morality. What's accepted as true is often just the version that won the argument, or had the power to be heard. Nietzsche wasn't saying that anything goes, or that truth doesn't matter. What he was saying is, be aware, be critical. Understand that what we call truth often hides a point of view. a belief system, a power structure, a motivation. So instead of chasing after absolute truths, Nietzsche encouraged us to become creators of meaning, to look at the world with fresh eyes and give it new interpretations that are bold, life-affirming, and truly our own. And here's the big takeaway. If everything is interpretation, then we have a choice. Not just in how we see the world, but in what we do with it. Thinking, then, isn't just intellectual. It's ethical. Because the way we choose to interpret the world shapes the kind of life we live, and the kind of world we help build. In The Republic, Plato presents a radical vision for a just society. The state should control every aspect of public and even private life. But far from being a merely authoritarian thinker, Plato's main goal is to build a harmonious city where each person occupies the role that best fits their nature. For Plato, the individual is not self-sufficient. Justice, understood as harmony between the parts of the soul, can only fully thrive in a well-ordered polis, where rulers, the I, philosopher kings, possess the wisdom needed to guide the collective. That's why individual freedom is not the highest value. What truly matters is the common good, which for Plato requires structure, rigorous education, and moral oversight. This vision includes measures that would be unthinkable today: censorship of myths, control over marriage and reproduction, and even the abolition of private property among the city's guardians. In his view, the state should shape its citizens from birth, because only then can disorder, born from ignorance and uncontrolled desires, be avoided. Modern readers, used to seeing the state as a necessary evil, may find this idea unsettling. But for Plato, this is a rational utopia, a project for a community where soul and society are in sync. His model is strict, yes, but it stems from a hope that under wise leadership, a more just, stable, and virtuous society is possible. Tocqueville, a keen observer of early American democracy, identified a troubling paradox. Government by the people can sometimes suppress the individual. When he speaks of the tyranny of the majority, he's not referring to oppression by a dictator, but to the subtle, yet powerful pressure of public opinion. In a democracy, decisions are made according to the will of the majority. But what happens to minorities, dissenting voices, or those who think differently? Tocqueville observed that political freedom doesn't automatically guarantee freedom of thought. In fact, the more socially uniform a society becomes, the greater the risk of conformity. The majority can impose its values not just through laws, but through moral pressure, public shaming, and quiet exclusion. This kind of tyranny isn't loud. It works from within. The fear of being judged, of standing apart from the crowd, can silence even the boldest minds. For Tocqueville, the real challenge of modern democracy is not just fair elections, but cultivating pluralism, diverse ideas, and the courage to be different. His warning remains relevant today. In the era of social media, where opinions spread at lightning speed, the tyranny of the majority shows up in online shaming, cancel culture, and snap judgments. Democracy, he reminds us, isn't the same as uniformity. It only truly exists when it protects the rights of every individual, including the right to be in the minority. In The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir delivered one of the most powerful insights in feminist thought. Woman is the other. With this, she revealed how patriarchal culture positioned masculinity as the norm, the default model of humanity, while relegating women to the role of the other, different, secondary, complementary. Historically, women weren't just excluded from politics and public life. They were defined through the male gaze, not as subjects, but as objects, not as voices, but as the ones spoken about. Female identity was shaped by myths, ideologies, and imposed roles that trapped women in narratives of fragility, emotion, and dependency. De Beauvoir shows this exclusion isn't natural. There's no inherent essence that makes women inferior or submissive. It's a social, cultural, and symbolic construction. The other is not a given, but a role shaped by power. Her analysis makes it clear the issue is not individual, it's structural. It's not about good intentions or small favors. It's about rethinking our entire idea of humanity. So there's no longer a center that defines and an other that obeys. When she says, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman, de Beauvoir affirms that gender is a construction. True liberation comes when each woman can see herself as the subject of her own story, not a reflection of others, but a full presence in the world. For Sartre, freedom isn't a gift, it's a burden. We aren't born with a predefined essence, a guidebook, or a destiny to fulfill. We are born, and from that moment on, every choice, every action, every silence shapes who we become. That's what he means when he says, man is condemned to be free. The word condemned is not an exaggeration. Sartre wants to highlight the existential weight of radical freedom. There's no way out. Even when we don't choose, we're choosing. Even when we follow rules, we're doing so because we chose to obey. That means we live in a constant state of responsibility. We can't hide behind religion, tradition, the state, or biology. These are all excuses we use to avoid the anxiety of choosing for ourselves. But Sartre argues that there's no way to outsource our existence. We are the sole authors of our lives, and that is both liberating and terrifying. Freedom, then, isn't doing whatever you want. It's owning your actions, knowing they define not only who you are, but the kind of world you help create. Every choice is a bet on what it means to be human, and that gives it a deep ethical dimension. To be free is to live without guarantees, but it's also the opportunity to create meaning, to become, to be. Sartre reminds us that in a world full of absurdity, freedom is the only certainty we have, and the hardest one to carry. Bertrand Russell, one of the 20th century's most influential thinkers, didn't treat the idea of God as a divine truth, but as a human creation. When he said, God is a concept invented by humans, he wasn't mocking faith, but shedding light on the psychological, social, and historical roots of belief. To Russell, the image of God emerged as a response to fear, uncertainty, and the desire for order in a chaotic world. In ancient times, when natural events were unexplained, attributing them to divine beings was a way to make sense of the unknown. Over time, those stories evolved into moral and metaphysical systems. But as science advanced and reason expanded, Russell argued that we no longer need supernatural explanations for the universe. From this perspective, God is not an external reality, but a product of human imagination. That doesn't mean the idea of God was meaningless. On the contrary, it played a crucial role in holding societies together, shaping moral codes, and offering comfort in suffering. Still, Russell believed it was possible to build a meaningful life without relying on divine belief. Ethics, meaning, and beauty can exist independently of religion. At its core, Russell's critique is a call for intellectual maturity. Letting go of the idea of God isn't an act of denial, it's an act of responsibility. It's recognizing that life's meaning isn't given to us. We must create it here and now for ourselves. François de la Rochefoucauld, a master of sharp and realistic maxims in the 17th century, had a very unromantic view of love. To him, what we often call pure love is actually a refined kind of disguised selfishness. He didn't deny love as a feeling. He just wanted to expose what's behind it. The desire to possess, to be validated, to project our own needs. According to La Rochefoucauld, even in the most tender relationships, there's an element of vanity. We love because, in some way, the other person makes us feel good about ourselves. We love the idea of being loved. Even our most selfless gestures can hide a personal need for recognition, control, or emotional reward. This view isn't cynical just for the sake of it. It's like a mirror. By showing that love isn't as pure as we'd like to think, he's inviting us to reflect on our real motivations. Love, in this light, isn't about sacrifice. It's a game of subtle interests, many of which we're not even aware of. But does that ruin love's beauty? Not necessarily. What La Rochefoucauld offers is brutal honesty. Love isn't about denying the ego, but maybe recognizing it, managing it, and, with luck, turning it into a connection. Love becomes less of a perfect ideal and more of a dance between two imperfect people who still choose to share the world. For Foucault, the idea of a stable, universal, unchanging human nature is a made-up concept, and a dangerous one. When we define what it means to be human in rigid terms, we also end up defining who isn't. That kind of definition always has political consequences. It justifies exclusion, normalization, and punishment. By saying there's no fixed human nature, Foucault shifts the conversation into history. He shows that what we think is natural actually changes over time. Madness, sexuality, crime, even childhood, all of these have been defined in different ways across different eras. That tells us that being human isn't about some deep, unchanging core. It's shaped by social practices and cultural discourse. This can be both freeing and unsettling. If there's no set human essence, then there's no final truth about what we're supposed to be. Everything is movement, mutation, reinvention. Identity becomes an open process. And that means we're responsible for shaping ourselves. By rejecting essentialism, Foucault opens the door for human diversity to be seen not as a deviation, but as power. Ethics stop being about fitting into a mold and start becoming a creative process. In this view, being human isn't about following a fixed formula. It's about exploring endless possibilities. Jean Baudrillard wasn't talking about computers when he said we live in a simulation. What he meant was something more philosophical and disturbing. In today's world of media, consumerism, and symbols, reality is no longer something direct and solid. What we experience are representations of reality, not reality itself. In a world filled with images, signs, and media, simulation replaces the real. Baudrillard called this hyperreality, a stage where copies, simulacra, don't. Just replace the originals, they become more real than reality. Think of ads, influencers, or social media. We create idealized versions of ourselves with filters, poses, and stories that eventually take the place of who we really are. But it gets deeper. If everything is a representation, then what is real? Where's the truth? Baudrillard suggests that the line between what is and what just seems to be is disappearing. We're living in a global theatre of appearances, where even politics and culture become just another show. This doesn't mean we should give up. It's a wake-up call. Baudrillard wants us to be aware of how reality is shaped by screens, brands, and official narratives, because in the middle of all this simulation, we can lose track of what's real. And maybe, to get it back, we need fewer images and more presence. Heraclitus, the mysterious pre-Socratic philosopher, saw reality as a constant battlefield. When he said war is the mother of all things, he wasn't praising literal violence. He was saying that conflict is what drives everything in existence. To him, war symbolizes the struggle between opposites, light and dark, life and death, order and chaos. It's this constant tension that creates movement, change, and creation. Nothing is born from total peace. Stability is an illusion. Reality is always in flux, shaped by opposing forces. Heraclitus challenges us to see the world not as a static system, but as a flow of creative tensions. Even the cosmos, which looks harmonious, is in fact the result of a balance that comes from battling forces. Peace, in this view, isn't the absence of conflict, but the result of a delicate and unstable balance. Applied to human life, this means growth, personal, social, intellectual, comes from struggle. There's no learning without questioning, no maturity without rupture. And as uncomfortable as that sounds, it's in the crisis that we become something new. Heraclitus isn't glorifying destruction, but recognizing that life moves through restlessness. War is the mother of all things, isn't about blood. It's a tribute to movement, to the force that pushes us out of our comfort zone. This famous quote from Heraclitus is one of the most poetic and deep lines in the history of philosophy. When he says everything flows, pantarai, he's expressing the idea that nothing stays fixed. Everything is always changing. Reality isn't a frozen block, it's a river in constant motion. You can't step in the same river twice, he said, because by the second time, the water has changed, and so have you. This image teaches us that time doesn't stop, that life is made of change, and that permanence is just a comforting illusion. This way of seeing things challenges us to live more consciously. Attachments, certainties, identities, everything is temporary. Trying to freeze the world or hold on to absolute truths is a resistance against the natural flow of things. Heraclitus suggests the opposite. Embrace change, accept becoming, live in sync with impermanence. But this doesn't mean giving up, it means awareness. Those who understand that everything changes become lighter, more present, and more free to transform themselves and the world. Time, in this view, isn't an enemy, it's the stage where everything unfolds. Epicurus has often been misunderstood. His name is still linked to wild hedonism, as if he promoted a life of indulgence and excess. But that image doesn't do justice to the depth of his philosophy. When he said that pleasure is the highest good, he meant a balanced and thoughtful kind of pleasure, not feasting or lust, but peace of mind and freedom from pain. To Epicurus, real pleasure is the kind that frees us. Freedom from fear of the gods, fear of death, physical pain, and the constant anxiety of never-ending desires. The highest pleasure doesn't come from unlimited consumption, but from inner peace, ataraxia, and physical well-being, aponia. It's about the art of living simply, but wisely. He valued friendships, quiet time, and calm reflection. To enjoy a pleasurable life, we must learn how to want wisely. Not every desire deserves to be satisfied. Many bring more trouble than joy. So, pleasure isn't the goal just because it feels good, but because it's the most direct way to happiness. Epicurus invites us to retrain our senses and thoughts. A pleasurable life isn't about intensity, it's about balance, a life of contentment, simplicity, and inner freedom. For Aristotle, no one is born virtuous, and you don't become a good person through divine inspiration. Virtue is, first and foremost, a practice. It's a habit that forms over time with effort and repeated choices. Instead of a sudden revelation, it's a slow build-up of character. Aristotle's ethics are grounded in everyday life. He doesn't speak of commandments or holy laws, but of real life, relationships, and how people grow through living with others. To be virtuous means finding the middle ground between extremes. Courage, for example, isn't being fearless or reckless. It's the right balance between both. Virtue grows from experience. We learn to be fair by acting fairly. We learn to be generous by being generous. Repeating these actions shapes our way of being until excellence becomes second nature. And this takes reflection, self-awareness, and guidance. Aristotle saw ethics as a journey. No one becomes virtuous by accident. That's why moral education is so important, not as brainwashing, but as nurturing good habits. At its core, he offers a philosophy of self-improvement, becoming the best version of yourself, not because someone else told you to, but because that's the most fulfilling way to live. Sartre flips traditional metaphysics upside down with this short but explosive idea. Existence comes before essence. What he means is that humans aren't born with a preset purpose or fixed identity. We exist first and only later define who we are. In other words, there's no blueprint for what a person should be. Each of us creates ourselves through our choices. This freedom is absolute, and unavoidable. Even choosing not to act is still a choice. This throws us into a world with no guarantees, no ultimate meaning, and no one to blame for what we become. Sartre calls this the condemnation to freedom. We're condemned because we can't escape it. But at the same time, it's our greatest power, the ability to imagine, invent, and transform. We're not essences waiting to be fulfilled. We're projects, constantly under construction. This idea can be scary, but it's also incredibly freeing. If there's no given essence, there's also no fixed destiny. The responsibility to give life meaning is ours alone. There's no script, just constant creation. Richard Dawkins, even as a scientist, offers an idea that crosses into philosophy, the notion that the human being is a biological fiction. This isn't about denying our physical reality, our bodies, brains, or feelings. It's about showing that what we call the self is a story built on a genetic foundation. At our core, we're just temporary carriers for genes that want to replicate themselves. That's the core idea of his famous selfish gene theory. The individual isn't the hero of evolution, but a means for passing on biological information. This undercuts the traditional humanist view that places humans at the top of creation or as the ultimate subject of the universe. This challenges the idea of the self as solid and independent. Our desires, choices, and passions are, in part, side effects of evolutionary strategies. Consciousness might be an evolutionary trick, a useful illusion that helps us survive, cooperate, and reproduce. But this fiction isn't a mistake. It's the structure that helps us move through a complex world. Dawkins shows that even though we come from impersonal biological processes, we can reflect, create culture, and even question our own instincts. Biology doesn't trap us. It's the stage where our stories unfold. John Locke rejected the idea that we're born with built-in knowledge, as if truths were written into our minds at birth. For him, the human mind is a blank slate, a tabula rasa, and knowledge is written onto it through experience. And that experience comes primarily through the senses: seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling. These are the doors through which the world enters us. Reason alone can't generate knowledge. It organizes, compares, and draws conclusions, but it can only work with the raw material provided by experience. Locke directly challenges rationalist philosophers like Descartes and restores a deep trust in observation. This form of empiricism transforms how we understand knowledge. If all knowledge comes from the senses, then it's naturally imperfect, changing, and open to correction. But it's also active, available, and democratic. You don't need a divine gift to know the world. Just attention, experimentation, and reflection. Locke opened the door to a new kind of philosophy that values education, science, and lifelong learning. And more than that, he laid the foundation for modernity by arguing that our beliefs should be rooted in real experience, not handed down as tradition or dogma. David Hume believed that morality isn't written in the stars or grounded in pure logic. Instead, it's born from human feelings. When he said there is no absolute good or evil, he was rejecting the idea that moral truths are universal and eternal. What we call morality isn't some objective discovery. It's built on shared emotions. Hume noticed that we judge actions as good or bad based on how we feel: empathy, disgust, approval, or outrage. These emotional reactions, not logic, shape our ideas of right and wrong. Morality, then, comes from living together, from human interactions and our ability to relate to each other. But that doesn't mean ethics are meaningless. In fact, grounding them in human experience gives them life. They aren't handed down from above, but formed in the context of real people and real relationships. That's why moral beliefs can change over time and differ across cultures. What's good in one place might be bad in another, and neither is absolutely right. Hume wasn't trying to destroy ethics. He wanted us to be honest about where it comes from. Reason can help explain our values, but it doesn't create them. Morality is deeply human, fragile, evolving, and worth reflecting on. Voltaire, a central figure of the Enlightenment, saw organized religion as fertile ground for abuse, intolerance, and superstition. When he said religious beliefs are unfounded, he wasn't just challenging theology, he was pushing a broader idea. That reason should guide human life. He strongly criticized the horrors committed in the name of faith, crusades, persecutions, inquisitions. His issue wasn't with personal spirituality, but with the way institutions use belief without evidence to control people. For Voltaire, accepting a doctrine without proof was a way of giving up intellectual freedom. His sharp wit was his weapon against fanaticism. One of his most famous lines, "Écrasez l'infâme," crush the infamy, was his rallying cry against ignorance enforced by religious power. He believed organized religion often fed fear and obedience, blocking progress in science, ethics, and thought. But Voltaire also championed tolerance. He didn't want to ban belief. He wanted to prevent it from becoming oppressive. People can believe what they want, as long as it doesn't lead to the suffering or domination of others. At its heart, his critique of religion was a call for clarity and courage. He wanted us to question anything that demands blind obedience. Instead of settling for mystery, Voltaire urged us to make curiosity a permanent part of life. Karl Popper didn't see science as a collection of eternal truths, but as a disciplined method of questioning and correcting mistakes. When he said science destroys myths, he meant that science's true value lies in its ability to challenge what we think we know. Science progresses through what he called falsifiability. It's not about proving theories right, it's about testing them until they break. Unlike dogma, which hides from doubt, science embraces uncertainty. Its strength lies in its humility. A good theory is one that can be questioned and possibly proven wrong. Myths, on the other hand, are closed systems. They offer comfort but resist challenge. Popper acknowledged that people need stories, but he warned us to be cautious of those stories that try to place themselves above reason. Science destroys myths not because it hates mystery, but because it treats mystery as a puzzle to explore. It doesn't accept "it's always been this way" as an answer. It asks, what if it isn't? Popper's critique isn't about rejecting culture or tradition. It's about refusing to let thought become lazy. Science, as he saw it, is a bold adventure of the mind. Mistakes aren't failures. They're part of the journey. Science doesn't hand out absolute truths. It offers tools to keep growing in a world that's always changing. Sigmund Freud revealed a part of the mind that reason can't control. By showing that the unconscious drives much of our thoughts, emotions, and actions, he shattered the old belief that humans are fully rational beings. According to Freud, we're not masters of our own minds. The unconscious is like a mental basement. In it live our repressed desires, forgotten memories, and instincts we can't admit. But they don't stay buried. They come up in dreams, slips of the tongue, physical symptoms, and strange behaviors. They shape our lives more than we realize. Freud didn't invent the idea of a deep mind, but he gave it a strong, structured theory. From that, he redefined freedom. To act freely doesn't just mean making a choice. It means understanding the hidden forces that push us to choose one way or another. That's the goal of psychoanalysis. Not to erase the unconscious, but to bring its contents to light and live with them more clearly. His idea still makes people uncomfortable because it takes away the illusion of full control. But it also makes us more human. Accepting the unconscious doesn't mean embracing chaos. It means recognizing that we're complex beings, pulled in many directions. And that understanding is the first step toward living with more clarity and compassion. For Spinoza, human beings aren't defined by pure reason or by some immaterial soul, but by something much more alive: desire. This desire, which he called conatus, is our inner drive to keep existing, to grow, to affirm life. Desire, in this view, isn't about lacking something. It's not a hole to be filled. It's a force that pushes us forward. It makes us seek knowledge, love, freedom. Every thought and action we have comes from this deep need to continue being. We don't desire because we're empty. We desire because we're alive. This idea challenges traditional views that treat desire as dangerous or something to be repressed. Spinoza sees desire as the foundation of ethics. To be ethical isn't to fight desire, but to understand it, shape it, and guide it with reason. Blind desire leads to slavery, but desire shaped by understanding leads to freedom. And freedom, for Spinoza, isn't doing whatever you want. It's acting with clarity, living in line with who you truly are. That's why knowing yourself becomes a path to power. A wise person isn't one who suppresses their desires, but one who turns desire into joy and fulfillment. For David Hume, the self is just a convenient illusion. When we look inside ourselves for something steady and unchanging, some inner core that stays the same over time, all we actually find is a stream of thoughts, feelings, and memories constantly shifting. Hume compared the mind to a theatre where various images flash by, one after another, but with no fixed stage beneath them. There isn't a separate me watching the show. There's only the show. The idea of a continuous self comes from our natural habit of stitching together these changing experiences into a neat story. But that story is built, not discovered. This idea goes against much of traditional philosophy and religion, which often treats the self as a permanent soul or true essence. Hume challenges us to let go of that belief. Maybe what we call ourselves is just a pattern our minds create, not a solid object we carry around inside. This has a powerful impact. If there's no fixed self, then our identity is flexible. We're always changing, always becoming, and that can be freeing. We don't have to stay locked into who we used to be. The lack of a permanent self isn't a loss. It's an open space for creativity and growth. Jean-Paul Sartre may not have written these exact words, but his philosophy clearly points to them. Freedom is unbearable, because in his view, being free means having no excuses. There's no God, no fixed essence, no destiny to fall back on. Every choice we make is fully ours, and so is the responsibility. That kind of radical freedom can be terrifying. Sartre called it anguish. The anxiety we feel when we realize we're the sole authors of our lives, with no script. So what do? We often run away. We hide in social roles, traditions, or rules. We lie to ourselves. Sartre called this self-deception, bad faith, pretending we're not really free so we don't have to face the weight of choosing. But that escape has a price. It costs us authenticity. Living fully means facing freedom head-on and answering it with action. There are no guarantees, no easy answers, but in that uncertainty lies our true humanity. Freedom is unbearable because it offers no safety net, but it's also the condition that allows us to create, to love, to change. Refusing it means not really living. Embracing it, even with fear, opens the door to becoming who we are and who we want to be. Contrary to the classic idea that reason should rule our emotions, Hume flipped the script. Reason is, and should be, the slave of the passions. He didn't mean that we should be irrational or impulsive, but that reason alone doesn't drive us to act. Emotions do. Reason, he said, is like a map, but a map is useless without a destination. It helps us find the best way to get somewhere, but it doesn't tell us where to go. Our desires and feelings give us that direction. Reason helps us achieve what we want, but what we want comes from the heart, not the head. This is a bold move. It recognizes that humans are emotional by nature. Trying to separate thought from feeling is artificial. Hume's insight has echoed into modern discussions about moral psychology, politics, and even economics. That doesn't mean reason is weak or unimportant. It just means we need to be honest about what it does. It doesn't choose our goals. It helps us reach them. Reason is most powerful when it understands the emotional currents it's working with, instead of pretending to float above them. Foucault challenged the comforting idea that truth is something pure, objective, and outside of language. For him, what we call truth is always produced within a system of discourse, shaped by history, power, and who's allowed to speak. That doesn't mean truth doesn't exist or that facts don't matter, but facts only make sense within a narrative. Medicine, law, religion, and science, all of them build their own versions of truth with their own rules about who gets to say what and how something becomes accepted as real. In that sense, truth isn't neutral, it's social. Foucault urges us to look at who defines truth, how they do it, and who gets excluded from the conversation, because behind every truth is a power structure. This doesn't mean we should give up on truth, but that we should question it more deeply. Truth has a history. If we understand where it came from, we're better equipped to challenge it or rewrite it when needed. Foucault's message is clear: stay alert. The more obvious something seems, the more we should ask who benefits from it. Walter Benjamin refused the idea that history is a steady march toward progress. Instead, he saw it as full of ruptures, losses, and forgotten voices. When he said that history has no meaning or direction, he was pushing back against the belief that time naturally leads to improvement. He warned that treating the present as better than the past often serves to justify violence. After all, how many times has injustice been excused as a necessary step toward a brighter future? His most powerful image is the angel of history, blown backward by the storm of progress, watching helplessly as wreckage piles up. History, he said, isn't a clean narrative of triumph. It's a landscape of tragedies, and it's our job to remember them. Benjamin didn't suggest giving up hope, but he demanded that we stop pretending everything is fine. The real job of history is to rescue what's been erased, to give voice to the defeated, and to awaken the possibilities that still exist in the past. The past isn't dead. It's waiting for someone brave enough to look at it differently and maybe change what comes next. Thrasymachus, a character in Book Y of the Republic by Plato, shows up to provoke discomfort. Instead of seeing justice as a virtue or harmony, he reduces it to a simple expression of power. What's called just is really just what benefits those in charge. To him, rulers make laws according to their own interests and call them just. The people, in turn, obey these laws believing they're acting rightly, when in fact they're just serving the interests of the powerful. Justice, then, isn't a universal moral rule, but an ideological tool to maintain domination. Plato, through Socrates, rejects this view, but the impact of Thrasymachus's argument still resonates today. Just look around. Who has the power to make laws, judge, and punish? How often does justice seem to favor those with more influence, more money, more voice? The strength of Thrasymachus's argument isn't in offering a moral system, but in exposing the hidden cynicism in what we call just. He forces us to ask, what is justice really? A moral rule, or the name given to the decisions of those in power? Even though he's defeated in Plato's dialogue, Thrasymachus leaves behind an uncomfortable idea. Maybe justice, in some situations, needs to be rebuilt, not just applied. And that means we must stay constantly alert to who has the power to define it. Albert Camus didn't say life is meaningless. He said it's absurd. That's a very different thing. The absurd, for Camus, comes from the collision between two forces, the human desire for meaning and the silence of the universe. We want answers, truths, reasons, but the world responds with nothing. This clash isn't tragic in itself, but eye-opening. Camus notices that once we realize there's no objective or given meaning, we face a real philosophical problem. And here's his great originality. He doesn't suggest we seek comfort, nor that we lie to ourselves with illusions. He proposes that we face the absurd with clarity. The central image in his philosophy is Sisyphus, condemned to push a boulder up a mountain forever. Camus imagines him happy, not because his burden has meaning, but because he accepts the absurd task and keeps going anyway. Freedom, in this case, doesn't come from changing reality, but from refusing to live a lie. Existence is absurd, and that's what sets us free. We're no longer prisoners of a higher plan. We become the authors of what we do with the time we have. That gives human life a tragic dignity. Even without guarantees, we still choose to live, love, and create. And maybe that's where the meaning we search for actually lives. This is one of Camus' most provocative statements, and he begins the myth of Sisyphus by saying that suicide is the only truly serious philosophical question. But he's not advocating for suicide. He's saying we need to face the question head-on. If life has no given meaning, is it worth living? For Camus, this is the heart of philosophy. He doesn't start with doubt, like Descartes. He starts with the absurd. Once we realize that the world offers no objective sense or purpose, the logical question arises: why go on? Still, Camus' answer is clear. Suicide is not the answer. It is, in fact, a surrender. The alternative he offers is lucid revolt, a commitment to live without appeal to anything beyond this world, facing the absurd honestly. To accept that life has no higher meaning and still choose to live it intensely is the most human thing we can do. So, suicide becomes a kind of limit or border in philosophy. It marks the line between giving up and resisting. Camus invites us to resist, not out of heroism, but out of courage. The courage to live even when the universe is silent, because in that silence lies our greatest freedom. Sigmund Freud, in his work Civilization and Its Discontents, presents a dark but honest view of the cost we pay to live in society. To him, civilization is built on repressing our desires. We're forced to control our instincts, especially sexual and aggressive ones, to be able to coexist. This repression is what allows for order, culture, and progress, but it also causes psychological suffering. Desires don't just go away when they're forbidden. They get pushed down, repressed, and return as symptoms. Anxiety, guilt, emotional distress. Civilization protects us from chaos, but it makes us sick in the process. Freud saw the conflict between the id, our instincts, and the superego, internalized morality, as something we all carry. The result is an inner tension that never completely goes away. The price we pay for peace is always a bit of personal unhappiness. But Freud isn't calling for a return to a wild, natural state. What he wants is awareness. If we can recognize this tension, we can learn to deal with it more consciously. Civilization may be repressive, but facing that truth is the first step toward finding freedom within it. Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist who reshaped the social sciences in the 20th century, showed that while culture is fascinating, it can also serve as a mechanism of domination. Studying different societies, he noticed that ethnocentrism, the belief that one's own culture is superior, is a powerful and silent form of oppression. Western societies often saw themselves as the model of civilization and judged other ways of life as primitive, backward, or inferior. This view justified colonization, massacres, and civilizing missions. But for Lévi-Strauss, there is no superior culture, just different ways of relating to the world. Culture, then, is an invention. Not in the sense of being fake, but in the sense of being constructed. It organizes reality, gives life meaning, but also imposes norms, silences differences, and defines what is normal or acceptable. And when one culture claims the right to define reality for everyone, it becomes oppressive. His critique isn't a call for total relativism, but for listening and humility. Every culture is rich in symbols, myths, and values, and none has a monopoly on truth. By recognizing this diversity, we take a step not only toward justice, but toward a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. In his first major work, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, Wittgenstein draws a deep and unsettling connection between language and reality. He states that we can only think what we can express. Therefore, the limit of our language is the limit of our world. What does this mean? That there's no such thing as pure, free thought floating above words. To think is to use signs, structure, and syntax. Language is the tool we use to organize the world, and also what traps us. If we don't have words for something, it becomes unspeakable, almost unthinkable. This radically changes the role of philosophy. It's no longer just about seeking absolute truths, but about investigating the mechanisms through which we describe the world. Language is not a neutral tool. It's the terrain where ideas are born and restricted. At the end of the Tractatus, Wittgenstein warns us, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." There are things beyond words, the ethical, the aesthetic, the mystical. These aren't denied, but they lie beyond explanation. That requires humility from philosophy, to understand that sometimes silence is the most philosophical response. In one of the most puzzling essays in modern philosophy, McTaggart argues that time, as we know it, is not real. He explains that the way we experience time, divided into past, present, and future, which he calls the A series, is logically inconsistent. According to him, events shift in time. Something that is future becomes present and then past. But if these categories change, then they can't be permanent properties of events. The alternative, the B series, where events are only seen in terms of earlier than or later than, lacks the experience of time. It's a static, logical ordering. The result? Time, in any form, collapses under analysis. This has a huge impact. If McTaggart is right, then time is just a useful illusion created by our minds, helpful for navigating life, but not real in itself. This idea contradicts everything we feel daily, but it forces us to rethink one of our most basic assumptions. The consequences spread far and wide, from physics to metaphysics, from literature to psychology. If time isn't real, then what is change? What is duration? What is a human life, if not a series of moments that maybe never actually flow? Before Kant, reason was seen as the supreme guide to truth. After Kant, it became an instrument with limits. In his masterpiece, Critique of Pure Reason, Kant shows that when reason is used beyond its legitimate scope, especially in matters like God, the soul, or the universe as a whole, it falls into contradictions. This doesn't mean reason is useless. On the contrary, it's essential, but it only works properly within the boundaries of experience. When it tries to go beyond those limits and talk about the thing in itself, reality as it exists independent of us, it gets lost in illusions and false conclusions. Kant believed that the problem wasn't thinking itself, but thinking without examining our tools. That's why reason needs to be critiqued, to understand what it can and can't know. Pure reason, left unchecked, creates grand systems that might look coherent but have no connection to reality. This discovery doesn't destroy knowledge, it builds a stronger foundation for it. It shows that science is possible, but that there's a limit to what we can know. And at that limit, other forms of relationship with the world emerge: ethics, aesthetics, and practical faith. Kant opens the door to a humble reason, one that's stronger because it knows where it stands. Oscar Wilde shocked his society by declaring, loud and clear, that art is not meant to serve morality, politics, or social improvement. His defense of aestheticism was bold. Art exists for its own sake, for beauty, for feeling, for the joy of creation, not to teach lessons or fix people's behavior. For Wilde, trying to make art useful morally corrupts both art and morality. Morality becomes rigid. Art becomes dull and preachy. The artist should be free to create without, obligation without homework to deliver a message. Beauty, in his view, is an independent value, maybe the most honest one. This was scandalous in Victorian England, where art was expected to uplift, inspire, and instruct. Wilde, instead, saw true art as a kind of rebellion against moral control. Real art isn't safe. It challenges, reveals, even offends, and that's its strength. His aestheticism wasn't superficial. It was a deep statement about freedom, the right to imagine and create without limits. Art, when it lets go of moral duties, doesn't become meaningless, it becomes more real. Because for Wilde, beauty is a necessary scandal. Philosophical nihilism, though often seen as pessimistic, is actually a radical realization. There is no given meaning to life, no eternal truths, no cosmic plan, no divine purpose. Nietzsche saw this as a crisis. The death of God would leave a hole in our values and beliefs. But he also saw it as an opportunity. If meaning isn't given, it must be created. In this sense, nihilism is a starting point. First, we break down the old structures. Then, with freedom, we build new ones. Camus, on the other hand, called this lack of meaning the absurd. Life doesn't come with a script, and that can feel scary. But rather than despair, he invites us to revolt, not violently, but by embracing life passionately, without lies. To love, to create, to laugh, not because life has meaning, but because we are the ones who give it meaning. So nihilism is not about destruction, it's about opportunity. It tears down the comforting illusions, and in doing so, it clears the ground for something new. When nothing is sacred, everything becomes possible, including a world where humans are once again at the center of their own existence. For Marx, capitalism doesn't just organize production, it shapes the very way we exist as human beings. Alienation is one of his central ideas. It refers to the disconnection between the worker and what they produce, between the individual and their own essence. In a capitalist system, work, which should be an expression of human creativity, becomes a repetitive and impersonal mechanism. The worker creates something that doesn't belong to them, something that is taken by the capitalist and sold as a commodity. Over time, the worker begins to see themselves as just another cog in the machine, useful but replaceable. This process doesn't just affect the economy, it impacts the human spirit. People are reduced to roles, numbers, functions. Life loses the taste of creation and autonomy. Marx saw this as one of the great tragedies of the modern world, a system that creates wealth at the cost of dehumanization. But Marx's critique is also an invitation. By understanding alienation, we can begin to imagine new ways of living and working. Work doesn't have to be a burden. It can be a way to reconnect with the world, with others, and with ourselves. But to do that, we need to transform our social relations and give people control over their own labor. Proudhon wasn't being metaphorical. He truly believed that private property, as it's traditionally defined, is an illegitimate appropriation of what should belong to everyone. For him, land, natural resources, and the means of production don't rightfully belong to anyone by divine or natural law. They belong to those who use them, who depend on them to survive. His critique runs deep. Private property isn't just a legal arrangement. It's a system of exclusion. What's mine automatically becomes not yours. And those who own nothing, they become dependent, exploited, forced to sell their labor just to stay alive. Proudhon didn't call for chaos or the destruction of everything individual. He made a clear distinction between property and possession. Possession refers to the legitimate, real, and necessary use of something. Property, in its concentrated, hoarded form, is what he called theft, someone profiting off the labor of many without working themselves. His proposal was radically egalitarian, a society where goods are shared cooperatively, where labor isn't exploited, and where value is distributed according to real contribution, not inheritance, privilege, or accumulated wealth. For Bakunin, the state isn't just an administrative structure, it's a mechanism of domination. He saw state institutions as perpetuating inequality, legalized violence, and the submission of the majority to a minority that holds political and economic power. Abolishing the state, in his view, doesn't mean chaos or the end of social organization. It means ending a hierarchical and authoritarian form of organization. Bakunin advocated for anarchism as a system based on self-management, solidarity, and the free association of individuals. According to him, the state never truly serves the people. It only rules in their name, and to preserve its power, it relies on force, law, and propaganda. Even when it presents itself as democratic, it carries the logic of oppression, centralization, obedience, surveillance. Freedom for Bakunin can only exist where there's real autonomy. That means trusting people, communities, and collectives, not leaders or political parties. Is his vision utopian? Maybe, but it's also deeply liberating, a belief in the human capacity to live together without coercion. In The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, Engels presents a historical and materialist view of the family. He argued that the monogamous family, as it developed in Western society, isn't natural or eternal. It's a social construction designed to preserve inheritance and control sexuality, especially women's. The bourgeois family, in his analysis, is like a miniature version of the capitalist system. It's hierarchical, it enforces gender roles, and it reproduces conservative values. Women are confined to the domestic sphere and become dependent on men. Children are conditioned from a young age to obey and internalize dominant moral values. Engels wasn't attacking love or affection. He was criticizing the patriarchal, oppressive model that turns human relationships into structures of control. For him, true human liberation, including women's liberation, depends on rethinking the family, not as a sacred institution, but as a potential space for equality and shared life. His critique remains relevant. By showing that the family is a historical institution rather than a divine one, Engels invites us to imagine new forms of living together, ones that are more just, free, and less rooted in domination. Saint Augustine, a Christian theologian and philosopher, wrote with striking clarity, "An unjust law is no law at all." This statement directly challenges blind legalism, the idea that a rule is legitimate simply because it's written or enforced. For him, justice stands above legality. A law must reflect goodness, otherwise it has no moral authority. This belief is grounded in ethics. True law aligns with divine reason, love, and truth. When human laws contradict eternal justice, when they promote oppression, inequality, or violence, they lose their legitimacy and become tools of tyranny. Augustine's position anticipates a powerful tradition, civil disobedience, the idea that not everything legal is right. Instead of blindly obeying cold, impersonal rules, we're called to evaluate them through conscience and a higher moral lens. His philosophy brings faith and reason together in a radical claim. Authority doesn't come from a legislator's pen. It comes from the commitment to justice. That makes Augustine's work a bridge between Christian ethics and critical legal theory, and a timeless reminder that not every law deserves obedience. For Bertrand Russell, one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century, faith, especially in its religious and dogmatic form, is essentially irrational. It doesn't rely on evidence, reason, or observation, but on believing something without proof, or even against reason. To him, this clashes with the critical mindset that should guide human thought. Russell didn't hate religious feelings, but he rejected the idea that we should believe something just out of tradition, fear, or blind obedience. He saw faith as a way of turning off our thinking, a shield used to protect certain ideas from being questioned. For him, that's not just a mistake, but a political and moral danger. Instead of faith, Russell advocated for doubt, curiosity, and open inquiry. A rational mind doesn't cling to absolute certainties, but it also isn't afraid of uncertainty. To Russell, this approach is more honest and more courageous. That doesn't mean reason has all the answers, but for Russell, it's better to live with open questions than with unproven answers. Blind faith pulls us away from the truth. Reason, even if imperfect, brings us closer, because it's always open to being corrected. When Derrida said, "There's nothing outside the text, il n'y a pas de hors texte," he wasn't denying reality. What he meant was that there's no pure, untouched meaning outside of language. Everything we know, understand, or try to explain comes through words, signs, and cultural systems. For Derrida, a text isn't just what's written on paper, it's everything that carries meaning. Our thoughts, conversations, media, even the way we see the world are all shaped by language. There's no direct access to reality. What we see is always filtered through interpretation. This challenges the idea that there's one true, objective meaning behind things. It reminds us that all meaning is constructed. Every time we speak or think, we're already interpreting. Derrida isn't saying reality doesn't exist. He's saying we only access it through stories, symbols, and systems. And if that's true, our job isn't to uncover a single hidden truth, but to explore how meaning is made, who controls the narrative, and what voices are missing. Judith Butler changed how we think about identity. For her, we're not born with a fixed, natural self. We become who we are through performance, relationships, and social rules. Identity, especially when it comes to gender and sexuality, isn't something we are, it's something we do. Being a man, a woman, or anything else isn't about biology. It's about repeating or resisting social expectations. Gender is performative. It doesn't reveal some inner truth. It creates what people see. Butler's view isn't about chaos. It's about freedom. If identity is built, it can be rebuilt. That opens up space for people to be who they really are, even if it doesn't fit the norm. More than a theory, it's an ethical stance. Respect difference, embrace diversity, and challenge the systems that try to box people in. Identity isn't a label, it's a living process. Foucault and Lacan both push the idea that the self we think we are, the one who says I am, isn't something natural or fixed. It's shaped by language, society, and power. Lacan, drawing from Freud, argued that our unconscious is structured like language. We don't exist fully before we speak. We're formed by the words and meanings around us. Foucault showed how institutions, schools, prisons, medicine, create categories of people, shaping how we see ourselves. In this view, the individual isn't the creator of meaning. They're created by the systems of meaning they're born into. You're not outside language, you're inside it, and it defines what you're allowed to be. That doesn't mean you're powerless. It means you can understand how your identity was built and maybe start changing the story. This phrase is a game changer in psychoanalysis. Lacan took Freud's idea of the unconscious and added something new. It isn't just a mess of repressed thoughts. It's structured, and it follows the logic of language. Desires, dreams, slip-ups, they all follow patterns. They speak, even if we don't hear them clearly. The unconscious talks through symbols, metaphors, and wordplay. That's why understanding it means learning to read it like a text. Lacan linked psychoanalysis to linguistics, especially the work of Saussure. He showed that the unconscious isn't a deep, silent space. It's filled with signs and meanings we inherited. We want things through language, and language always leaves a gap. So, knowing yourself isn't about digging for a single truth. It's about learning to listen to the strange, shifting language inside you. And that makes self-knowledge an ongoing creative process, not a final answer. This famous phrase, often linked to Nietzsche and deeply explored by Walter Benjamin, is a sharp critique of how history is constructed. It's not just about telling facts. It's about who tells them, why they're told, and who gets left. Out in the process, Nietzsche noticed that historical narratives are often used as tools to legitimize power. The victors don't just win on the battlefield, they also win in the libraries. They shape collective memory, deciding what gets remembered and what gets erased. Benjamin takes it further. In his theses on the philosophy of history, he describes an angel of history who looks back and sees nothing but wreckage. What we usually celebrate as progress, he argues, is actually built on the ruins of those who lost. And those forgotten, the silenced and oppressed, still cry out for justice. History isn't neutral. It's a battlefield where different versions compete and where truth is often the result of power. That's why recovering silenced voices isn't just a historical task, it's an ethical one. It's about bearing witness to what was erased. It's about writing history more fairly because it's still being written. Ivan Illich, radical and ahead of his time, shook the foundations of modern education when he claimed that school doesn't liberate, it dominates. In his book Deschooling Society, he argues that formal schooling doesn't teach people how to think, it teaches them how to obey. Schools, he says, are not neutral. They're ideological tools that rank, label, reward conformity, and punish difference. Grades, schedules, rigid curriculums, they're all ways to tame curiosity and shape it to fit the needs of the system. More than delivering knowledge, the institutionalized school teaches people to compete, follow orders, and chase external approval. Illich wasn't against learning. Far from it. He called for a deschooled society, one where people learn freely through real interest in community and without coercion. His ideas anticipated many of today's criticisms of formal education: standardization, over-medicalization of kids, and the loss of deeper meaning. Illich challenges us to imagine a way of learning that doesn't turn people into products, but awakens free individuals who learn with the world, not against it. Michel Foucault breaks down one of the most taken for granted ideas in society, what we call normal. For him, normality isn't a natural truth. It's a historical construct, shaped by institutions of control like medicine, psychiatry, education, and the legal system. Normal tells us what's desirable, acceptable, and allowed. Abnormal is whatever doesn't fit and must be corrected, watched, treated, or excluded. Medicine defines mental illness. Schools set behavior standards. The law decides who's dangerous. These are all systems of power dressed up as knowledge. But this control isn't just external. We internalize these rules. We start to police ourselves, strive to be normal, and fear stepping outside the lines. Power doesn't just repress, it shapes people who self-regulate. Foucault isn't saying society should have no structure. He's inviting us to question the structures we've been taught to see as natural. When we realize that normal is constructed, we open the door to new ways of living, thinking, and being. What's considered normal might just be a tool of control disguised as common sense. One of Foucault's most powerful ideas was to shift our understanding of power away from a centralized force, like the state, and towards something much more complex. For him, power isn't something you have. It's a web of relationships, a constant flow that moves through institutions, language, and even our bodies. The state is just one node in that web. Power shows up in classrooms, doctors' offices, factories, city layouts, social rules, even in the way we look at each other. It doesn't always command through force. More often, it works through norms, habits, and expectations that shape how we act and what we think is possible. This changes how we think about resistance. It's not just about fighting governments or taking over power structures. It's about noticing how power operates in everyday life and how we, often unknowingly, help keep it going. By saying power is everywhere, Foucault isn't saying everything is oppressive. He's saying everything is a site of struggle. Resistance isn't just a political act, it's an existential one. It starts in the small stuff, questioning the everyday normals we take for granted. According to philosopher Daniel Dennett, the self, that inner center we believe defines who we are, is actually a mental construction. It's a story we tell ourselves to make sense of the chaos of experience. There isn't a solid you hiding inside your brain. What we have is a bunch of mental processes that our minds stitch together into a coherent story, like chapters in a novel. Dennett says the brain works like a narrative center. It pulls together memories, perceptions, desires, and decisions, and turns them into a personal theory, a storyline we live by. This story feels real, but it's not necessarily true. It's a functional fiction that helps us stay consistent and act with purpose. This idea challenges both the religious view of a soul and the philosophical idea of a fixed inner self. Instead, Dennett gives us a self that's more like a character, constantly being rewritten by culture, language, and our own biology. But that's not a bad thing. In fact, this fiction is what makes things like responsibility, memory, and future planning possible. The key is knowing that we're the ones telling the story, which means we also have the power and the danger of lying to ourselves. The self isn't something we discover, it's something we create. Foucault flips one of the most sacred ideas in Western culture, the belief that truth is always liberating. For him, truth, as it's shaped in modern societies, isn't neutral, and it doesn't automatically lead to freedom. In fact, it can be a powerful tool of control. All truth is created within a system of power. That means truth depends on who gets to speak, what they can speak about, how they say it, and why they're considered legitimate. Medical, legal, and psychiatric truths, for example, don't just describe reality. They define what's normal, watch people, judge them, and sometimes punish them. To tell the truth can often mean reinforcing norms, shutting down alternatives, and pushing certain people or ways of life to the margins. That's why Foucault warns us to be skeptical of truth with a capital T. What looks like freedom might just be a more sophisticated kind of control. He's not saying there's no reality. He's saying we should always question how truths are made. Instead of chasing some final, absolute truth, we should ask, what kind of truth is this? Who created it? Who benefits from it? And who gets silenced because of it? Maybe real freedom doesn't come from finding the truth, but from challenging the truths that pretend to be the only ones that matter. Nietzsche saw philosophy as something radically critical and creative. For him, the philosopher's role isn't to preserve eternal truths, it's to smash idols. And by idols, he meant outdated ideas, sacred concepts, and unquestioned truths. He even called himself a stick of dynamite. Idols are beliefs that people stop questioning. Things like pure reason, absolute morality, universal good, God, or progress. To Nietzsche, these are human creations that have been mistaken for natural or necessary truths. Philosophy's job is to break them down, reveal what they're built on, and expose their contradictions. But destroying idols doesn't mean burning everything down. It's about making space for new values, values rooted in real life, the body, and direct experience. Nietzsche's kind of philosophy is about affirming existence and creating meaning in a world without ultimate foundations. Thinking, in Nietzsche's view, is not just logical, it's aesthetic, ethical, and political. And it takes courage, because once you tear down an idol, you're left with a void. And it's in that uncertain space where the true philosopher is born. Graham Priest, a leading figure in paraconsistent logic, challenged one of the oldest rules in philosophy, the law of non-contradiction. He argues that in certain situations, a statement and its opposite can both be true at the same time. That's a direct challenge to Aristotle and centuries of classical logic. But this isn't just a logical game. In complex systems, like computing, natural language, or semantic paradoxes, accepting some contradictions can actually prevent total collapse. Refusing contradiction at all costs, Priest argues, can sometimes make things worse. Paraconsistent. Logic doesn't throw reason out the window, it refines it. It shows that logic isn't a rigid structure, but a tool that should be adapted to the situation. Priest pushes back against black and white thinking and invites us to embrace a more flexible way of reasoning. one that can handle the messiness of real life. In this view, thinking clearly isn't about following fixed rules. It's about knowing which rules fit which problems. Sometimes, real rationality means knowing when to bend the rules, to see reality more completely. When Hannah Arendt examined the case of Adolf Eichmann, one of the organizers of the Holocaust, she made a chilling observation. Evil didn't look monstrous. It looked ordinary. Eichmann wasn't a sadist. He was a regular guy who used administrative logic to coordinate mass murder. That led Arendt to a disturbing conclusion. Reason alone doesn't guarantee ethics. It can be used to build efficient systems of destruction, as long as those systems are logically consistent. Evil doesn't always come from hatred. Sometimes it comes from people just following orders. Modern rationality, obsessed with efficiency, order, and predictability, can lose sight of moral judgment. Rules replace conscience. A person can become a perfect bureaucrat while helping carry out horror, and never stop to ask why. Arendt's warning is clear. Ethics takes more than logic. It takes reflection, judgment, and the courage to say no when everyone else is saying yes. Evil doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from the absence of thought, where thinking should be. The famous phrase, "the banality of evil," coined by Arendt, doesn't downplay the horror of Nazi crimes. It actually makes them even more terrifying, because it shows that evil doesn't always come from monsters, ideologues, or psychopaths. Sometimes it comes from ordinary people who simply follow orders and never question the system. The banality lies in the routine of evil, in carrying it out without reflection, empathy, or resistance. Eichmann didn't scream hate speeches. He didn't even seem to hate Jews. He signed papers, scheduled trains, quoted Kant without understanding him, and in that mechanical obedience, he played a key role in one of history's greatest horrors. Arendt's insight reveals a subtle danger, a society that values performance, obedience, and productivity, but doesn't teach people how to think ethically. Banal evil is the kind that hides in everyday routines, bureaucracy, and silence. Her answer to this is simple but powerful: thinking. Thinking deeply in a way that breaks the cycle of passivity. For Arendt, this is the real antidote to evil. It's not enough to be good. You have to refuse to be a cog in the machine. To Heidegger, modern technology isn't just a set of useful tools. It's a way of seeing the world. He called this view Gestell, or enframing, a mindset that reduces everything, including human beings, to resources. Something to be used, calculated, and exploited. In this technological frame, nature is no longer something we admire or connect with. It becomes a supply. Forests become timber, rivers become hydroelectric power, and people become human resources. Technology shifts how we relate to existence itself, pushing us toward a cold, utilitarian mindset. But Heidegger wasn't anti-technology. He didn't say we should reject it, only that we must think deeply about how it shapes us. The real danger isn't the machines, but the loss of contemplative thinking, the replacement of being with functioning. To dehumanize in this sense is to forget the mystery of existence, to live on autopilot, to treat everything and everyone as a means to an end. The solution: rediscover a different way of being in the world, less controlling, more reflective, because only those who truly think can resist becoming part of the machine. Feyerabend shook the foundations of philosophy of science by claiming that science is not the only legitimate way of knowing the world. For him, science is a powerful story, but not the only one. In fact, what we often call scientific has been shaped by history, politics, and culture, not just logic or evidence. His critique targets scientism, the belief that science is pure, objective, and superior to all other knowledge systems. In books like Against Method, Feyerabend argued that there is no single scientific method. Many scientific breakthroughs actually happened by breaking the rules, mixing in art, intuition, tradition, and even ideology. By calling science a narrative, he wasn't denying its value. He was challenging its authority, and in doing so, he made room for marginalized ways of knowing: indigenous wisdom, folk medicine, Eastern philosophies. Knowledge, he said, isn't a pyramid with science at the top. It's a diverse constellation. His thinking makes people uncomfortable because it challenges the hierarchy of knowledge. But it also frees us. It invites us to think boldly, creatively, and with curiosity. After all, truth doesn't only live in labs. It can come from the most unexpected places. Thomas Kuhn shook the foundations of the scientific ideal by challenging the belief that science is a linear, cumulative, and purely objective reflection of reality. He introduced the concept of a paradigm, a set of beliefs, values, and methods that shape what scientists notice and what they ignore. In his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Kuhn shows that science moves forward not through steady progress, but through sudden shifts. When a paradigm falls into crisis, it's replaced. And that change is not just rational, but also cultural, psychological, and even political. That means objectivity, as traditionally imagined, is an illusion. Scientists aren't neutral observers. They're shaped by history, by expectations, by language. What counts as a fact depends on the current framework of thinking. Kuhn's point doesn't discredit science, it makes it more human. Scientific knowledge is powerful, but it's also situated, interpretive, and evolving. That's why it should always be questioned, revisited, and reimagined. There's no timeless truth, only a constant search for better understanding. Spengler wrote The Decline of the West during a time when modern confidence was crumbling. While Enlightenment thinkers believed history moves toward constant improvement, Spengler offered a different view. Civilizations are like living organisms. They're born, they grow, they peak, and eventually they die. In his eyes, Western civilization has already passed its prime. What's ahead isn't progress, but decline. Cultural exhaustion, mechanical living, spiritual erosion, technological advances don't mean moral growth. Rationality doesn't guarantee wisdom. History, he says, isn't an upward ladder. It's a cycle. It's a dark vision, but not hopeless. It's a call for humility. It reminds us that assuming we've finally figured it out can blind us to warning signs. Spengler asks, what if what we call progress is actually a more polished version of decay? His view might bother optimists, but it's deeply thought-provoking. He reminds us that nothing, not even science, freedom, or democracy, lasts forever. And maybe real progress starts with recognizing the limits of our own civilization. Both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche looked at European culture in their time and saw signs of deep decay. For Schopenhauer, civilization is a desperate attempt to escape suffering, but the more it develops, the more refined and unbearable that suffering becomes. Nietzsche, on the other hand, saw a society weakened by decaying values, herd morality, denial of life, the taming of instincts. Modern civilization, by moving away from tragedy, passion, and creative strength, turns people into obedient, domesticated beings. Both philosophers believe civilization had lost touch with its vital core. It chases comfort instead of greatness. It fears pain more than it desires power. To them, technological progress hides a growing spiritual emptiness. But this isn't just criticism, it's a challenge. Either we reconnect with our inner creative force, or we sink into a world full of consumption and empty of meaning. Decline isn't the end. It's a sign that something new needs to emerge. But for that to happen, we need the courage to face collapse and move through it. Nietzsche wasn't afraid to challenge even the most noble feelings. To him, compassion isn't always pure altruism. Often it's a refined form of selfishness, a way to feel morally superior or to boost our ego. Instead of lifting someone up, It can serve more to make us feel like good people. He saw danger in compassion, the risk of glorifying weakness, reinforcing victimhood, and making suffering the center of life. In a culture that puts pity above strength, Nietzsche believed we lose our drive to grow, to fight, to overcome. Sometimes those who pity aren't helping. They're infantilizing. That doesn't mean we should be cruel, but we should be skeptical of emotions that place us in the role of the savior. For Nietzsche, true greatness isn't found in comforting the one who suffers, but in inspiring them to rise above their suffering. He proposes an ethic based on strength, not domination, but creation. Compassion, when it's real and active, can be powerful, but when it's just moral theatre, it becomes a mask. Nietzsche urges us to stop loving people's pain and start loving their ability to rise from it. For both Buddha and Schopenhauer, though from different traditions, one thing is clear: suffering is at the core of human existence. Birth, loss, unfulfilled desire, aging, death, all of it is part of being alive. Buddha called it dukkha, the deep discomfort that runs through all conditioned experience. The cause? Attachment, constant craving, and the illusion of permanence. For him, liberation comes from letting go of desire, practicing mindfulness, and releasing the ego. Schopenhauer, on the other hand, saw life as driven by an endless blind force he called the will. We're always wanting something, and even when we get it, we want more. So life swings between boredom and pain. His solution? Deny the will, quiet the impulses, and find peace in detachment. Neither thinker is preaching despair. They're offering clarity. Pain is part of life. The first step to living wisely is to recognize it. Maybe we can't eliminate suffering, but we can change how we relate to it. Schopenhauer flips the traditional view of reality on its head. For him, the world isn't built on reason or material things. It's built on will, a blind, irrational force that pulses through everything that lives. And this will isn't conscious. It's drive, craving, pure life energy. What we perceive, the world of appearances, is just surface. Beneath it lies this relentless will, constantly expressing itself in every form of life. Our bodies, physical expressions of the will. Our suffering, a direct result of our endless wanting. To desire is to suffer. It's a dark view, but also profound. Once we see that the will drives all things, Schopenhauer believes we can find wisdom, not in chasing desires, but in learning to quiet them. Through art, beauty, compassion, and even self-denial, we can momentarily step outside the grip of the will. So for Schopenhauer, reality isn't a logical system. It's a storm of clashing forces. Real peace doesn't come from control or achievement, but from surrender. The true hero isn't the one who conquers the world, it's the one who learns to stop wanting it. For Thomas Metzinger, a philosopher of mind and neuroscience, consciousness isn't a divine gift or some kind of immaterial soul. It's an evolutionary byproduct. It showed up because it helped our ancestors survive. But that doesn't mean it has some deeper purpose. According to Metzinger, what we call the self is actually just a mental model created by the brain, a functional construction that combines perception, memory, and action. Consciousness is like a high-level simulation. And here's the twist. There's no real someone behind it all. The I we think we are. It's a useful fiction, generated by unconscious processes. This flips the whole idea of a true self upside down and leads to a tough question. If there's no solid me, then who's reading this sentence? Consciousness is real, but it doesn't have any independent substance. This might sound unsettling, but Metzinger sees it as freeing. If we understand that we're self-modeling systems, maybe we can rethink how we live, suffer, or get attached to things. Consciousness may be an accident, but it can still be a gateway to a more honest, clear-minded way of living. Most people assume they have free will. that they're in control of their decisions. But thinkers like Spinoza and Sam Harris argue that this belief is an illusion. They say our actions are always the result of prior causes: biology, environment, and personal history. Spinoza put it simply: humans think they're free because they don't see the chains pulling them. Harris, combining philosophy with neuroscience, points to brain research showing that decisions are made before we're even aware of them. Free will, then, is just a feeling, not a fact. This idea shakes up how we think about guilt, praise, and punishment. If no one truly chooses who they are, how can we judge others fairly? The answer isn't to throw out responsibility, it's to redefine it. We need more compassion, focus on prevention and healing, and a deeper understanding of human behavior. Saying, free will doesn't exist, isn't fatalism. It's actually a chance to live more consciously, by recognizing what drives us and making choices that aren't based on blame, but on awareness. For George Berkeley, to be is to be perceived, esse es percipi. That means reality doesn't exist independently of the mind. The material world, trees, buildings, objects, only exists as long as someone is perceiving it. Without perception, there's no standalone physical substance. Berkeley isn't saying the world is fake or an illusion. He's saying its existence depends on being perceived. And when you're not looking at a tree, it doesn't vanish, because God, the ultimate spirit, is always perceiving everything and holding the world in existence. This kind of radical idealism flips traditional metaphysics on its head. Instead of solid matter as the base of reality, Berkeley puts mental experience front and center. There's no hidden thing behind appearances. The appearances are the thing. At first, his view sounds strange, but it's powerful. It forces us to question the idea of an objective world out there and instead see reality as something deeply connected to perception. Berkeley's philosophy even foreshadows modern debates about virtual reality, consciousness, and how we construct the world around us. David Hume takes apart one of the oldest and most accepted ideas in philosophy, that everything must have a cause, including the universe itself. For him, this idea isn't a logical truth, it's just a habit of thought. We're used to seeing patterns and assuming every effect must have a cause, but that doesn't prove anything. When we try to apply that logic to the universe as a whole, we're stepping outside the rules. The concept of cause only makes sense within time, change, and relationships between things. But the universe, as the totality of everything, doesn't fit into that. Asking what caused the universe might be like asking what's north of the North Pole. It's just the wrong kind of question. Hume also reminds us we never actually see causality. We only see that event A is regularly followed by event B. The connection is assumed, not observed. By rejecting the idea that the universe needs a cause, Hume undermines many traditional cosmological arguments and pushes us toward philosophical humility. Maybe the universe just is, and the fact that there's no deeper explanation isn't a flaw. It's the mystery at the heart of existence. Logical positivism, a major philosophical movement in the 20th century, took a hard stance against traditional metaphysics. Thinkers like Rudolf Carnap and A.J. Ayer argued that statements like God exists, the soul is immortal, or being is are neither true nor false. They're just meaningless. Their view was simple. A statement only has meaning if it can be tested through experience or proven through logic. If something can't be measured, observed, or logically deduced, then it's outside the realm of knowledge. Metaphysics, by that standard, is just noise, or, as Ayer put it, linguistic delirium. That doesn't mean deep human questions don't matter. But logical positivism insisted that philosophy should be clear, rigorous, and grounded in science. The role of a philosopher isn't to speculate about invisible realities, but to clarify language and cut through confusion. This critique had a huge impact. It pushed metaphysics out of academic philosophy for decades. Over time, It's strict, rules softened, and many now agree that not everything that matters can be verified. But the core challenge remains. Deep thinking requires clarity, precision, and sometimes the courage to admit when we just don't know. For Freud, religion isn't just a belief system. It's a psychological response to human anxiety. In The Future of an Illusion, he describes religion as a comforting fantasy, born from our fear of a chaotic and dangerous world. In Freud's view, God is a projection of the idealized father, powerful, just, protective, and also punishing. Religious beliefs give people meaning, structure, and hope, but they do so at the cost of facing reality. Religion, he says, is a collective delusion, not in the sense of madness, but in the sense of wishful thinking disguised as truth. Freud doesn't mock believers. He understands the emotional and social power of faith. But he argues that maturity means facing life without illusions, accepting that we don't have cosmic guarantees. Science, even with its limits, is a more honest way to deal with the unknown. For Freud, moving beyond religion wouldn't destroy meaning. It would make room for a clearer, more grounded humanism based on self-awareness and solidarity. His critique isn't about attacking spirituality, but about confronting the tendency to hide from truth for the sake of comfort. Camus and Schopenhauer, although very different in style, agreed on something essential. Suffering is part of life, but it doesn't have any deeper meaning. It's not punishment. It's not a test. It's not a path to something better. It just is. And trying to justify it can be a way of denying reality. Schopenhauer saw suffering as the mark of the will, a blind force that drives us and drains us. We suffer because we desire, and desire means we're never truly satisfied. So suffering is built into life itself. It's not just something that happens by chance. Camus, on the other hand, focused on the absurd, a world that doesn't care, where we search for meaning but never get clear answers. In his view, the real mistake is trying to explain suffering at all. Both thinkers believed that maturity doesn't come from pretending suffering has a purpose, but from facing it honestly. Schopenhauer suggests letting go of the will. Camus calls for clear-eyed rebellion. Suffering doesn't need to mean something in order to be faced, and maybe, because it has no meaning, it challenges us to create our own, not as a solution, but as an act of freedom. Moral relativism challenges the idea that there's one universal ethics that applies to all people, all the time. From this point of view, moral values are created by societies, shaped by history, culture, and language. What's right in one place might be wrong in another, and no culture holds the ultimate truth. That doesn't mean anything goes. Relativism isn't the same as having no morals or excusing everything. What it says is that moral judgments only make sense within a specific cultural context. So judging another culture by your own standards can be narrow-minded and often unfair. This view calls for tolerance and deeper listening. But it also brings up a real dilemma. How do we criticize things that are clearly violent or oppressive? Can we say slavery or racism are objectively wrong? Relativism forces us to find ethical principles that respect diversity and stand strong against injustice. At its best, moral relativism invites us to see ethics as a conversation between different ways of life, not a rulebook handed down from above, and that, in itself, can be a deeply ethical stance, honoring the complexity of what it means to be human. Democracy is often praised as the system of freedom and equality, but it also has some serious critics. Plato, in the Republic, saw democracy as the rule of the uninformed majority, a system where people are easily manipulated, and the desire for freedom can spiral into chaos or tyranny disguised as choice. Centuries later, Noam Chomsky made a similar critique from a modern angle. In his view, liberal democracy is often run by economic elites, controlled media, and systems designed to shape public opinion. Yes, people vote, but usually within boundaries already set by those in power. For both thinkers, the problem isn't with the idea of democracy. It's with how it plays out in the real world. When information is distorted, debate is shallow, and inequality means not all voices carry the same weight. Democracy becomes more of a performance than true participation. The illusion is in mistaking the process for the substance. Real democracy isn't just voting. It's critical thinking, access to truth, and equal power to shape society. Without that, democracy turns into a show, a scripted performance dressed up as freedom. Henri Bergson makes an important distinction between two kinds of time: clock time, which is measurable, mechanical, and linear, and lived time, which he calls duration. Lived time is fluid, internal, emotional, and completely personal. We don't experience time as ticking seconds on a clock. We feel it as a flow of consciousness, where memories shape the present and hopes stretch into the future. Our emotions, our moods, our expectations, they all change how time feels. For Bergson, trying to define time using math and science misses the point. Science can measure time, but it doesn't feel it. Philosophy, if it wants to stay true to life, should focus on how we experience time, not how we count it. This idea influenced fields like psychology, phenomenology, and even modern physics. For Bergson, time isn't just part of the universe, it's something that pulses through our soul. And to truly understand it, we need more intuition than calculation. We love the idea of freedom. But for thinkers like Sartre and Dostoevsky, real freedom comes with a heavy price. Sartre says we are radically free. No God to guide us, no destiny to lean on. We have to choose who we are, moment by moment, and that freedom can feel like a burden. It brings anxiety, because being free means we can't blame fate, tradition, or anyone else. Every choice or refusal to choose is on us. That kind of responsibility can be overwhelming. Dostoevsky, in The Brothers Karamazov, explores the same idea. When given total freedom, people often choose security instead. They'd rather follow authority, believe in miracles, or obey a higher power than face the pain of total independence. True freedom means living without excuses. It means taking full ownership of your life, even when it hurts. It's not easy, but in that weight lies your power to create who you are. Emil Durkheim, one of the founders of sociology, challenged the idea that crime is just a personal failure or moral flaw. For him, crime is a social phenomenon. It's shaped by the structure and values of the society we live in. Every society defines what counts as a crime based on its own rules. And strangely enough, crime can serve a purpose. It tests norms, sparks change, and reveals hidden tensions. In that way, crime is a sign that a society is still evolving. Even more, when a society is unequal, violent, or unfair, it actually produces the crime it later punishes. Poverty, exclusion, lack of opportunity, these aren't excuses, but they are real causes. Durkheim isn't saying we should celebrate crime. He's saying we need to understand it. If we just punish without asking why, we repeat the cycle. Crime is a mirror, and if we break the mirror instead of facing what it shows, nothing gets better. Foucault and Kelsen had very different approaches, but they agreed on one thing. The law isn't born from justice. It's a tool of power. Kelsen, with his pure theory of law, clearly separates law from morality. A law doesn't have to be just, to be valid. It just has to fit within a coherent legal system. Foucault takes this further. He sees law as a way to institutionalize power. Laws aren't based on some universal reason. They come from historical struggles, dominant interests, and systems of control. Justice, in this view, isn't what creates the law. It's the story we tell to justify it. When people say that law reflects justice, Foucault would ask, whose justice? For who? He points out how the law often reinforces inequality, controls bodies, and defines what counts as normal or deviant. In that sense, the law isn't neutral, it's political to its core. Seeing law as a product of power isn't about being cynical. It's about being clear-eyed. It's a way to rethink what justice could mean beyond what's written in legal codes. Machiavelli, with his brutally honest take on politics, breaks the fantasy that virtue alone can change the world. For him, virtue isn't about being good, it's about being effective, strategic, and brave enough to act. And without power, that virtue is like a sword with no one to hold it. Useless. In real life, achieving justice requires strength. Being a good leader isn't enough if you can't enforce decisions. A ruler who's virtuous but powerless ends up crushed by those who are less ethical but more capable, and the people suffer for it. Machiavelli isn't saying that the ends always justify the means. He's saying that power isn't automatically dirty, it's necessary. Without it, virtue stays stuck in the world of ideas and never becomes reality. His philosophy shows that ethics and politics don't have to be enemies, but power is the bridge between them. The goal isn't to reject power, but to use it wisely with the common good in mind. That takes more than purity. It takes practical wisdom. For Roland Barthes, love isn't some eternal universal feeling. It's a cultural creation. In his book, A Lover's Discourse, he describes love as a kind of language, full of signs, expectations, and emotional habits we've inherited. What we think we naturally feel has actually been shaped by history. We learn how to love from stories, from medieval courtship to modern romantic comedies. Every era teaches a different version of love. So-called true love is, in many ways, a performance shaped by literature, media, and social scripts. This doesn't mean love is fake. It means it's human. Recognizing that love is a social construct actually makes it more flexible. It opens space for different ways to feel, to relate, and to care. Barthes doesn't try to destroy love. He wants to free it. By revealing the myths behind it, he invites us to love more honestly, not by following someone else's script, but by creating our own. Deleuze and Guattari completely changed how we think about desire. For them, desire isn't about lack, as Freud and Lacan believed. It's about production, flow, and creative movement. And because it's always moving, desire never finishes, never settles. Desire desires more desire. It doesn't aim for one final object. It seeks processes, connections, and multiplicities. Every time we think we've fulfilled a desire, it's already shifted somewhere else. It works like a machine, not one that consumes, but one that creates reality. This challenges the idea that we'll be happy once we finally get what we want. Desire has no end, and it's not supposed to. It's the life force of the unconscious, the engine behind creation, politics, and art. To desire is not to search for completeness. It's to embrace the unfinished nature of being alive. And in that acceptance, we don't find frustration, we find power. Foucault breaks down the idea that sexuality is just a natural, spontaneous part of who we are. For him, sexuality is shaped by discourse, institutions, systems of knowledge, and social practices that teach us how to feel, desire, and even see ourselves. Sexuality isn't just repressed, it's managed, categorized, and controlled. What we call normal or deviant doesn't come from biology. It comes from power structures that define and regulate bodies. Medicine, religion, and law have all played a role in deciding what's acceptable sex. Foucault shows that power doesn't only work by saying no, it also creates identities. It doesn't just silence us, it makes us talk about sex, confess, label ourselves. The idea of a sexual self is a modern invention, shaped by systems that discipline us from the inside. So sexuality is political, not because it should be, but because it always has been. To think about sexuality is to examine the forces that govern us deep within. In Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud argues that culture only exists because we repress our human impulses. To live together in society, we have to hold back our desires, especially the sexual and aggressive ones. This repression creates civilization, but it also creates discomfort and unease. Adorno, building on both Marx and Freud, pushes this idea even further. He sees culture, especially mass culture, not as liberation, but as a tool of control. The culture industry shapes passive individuals, addicted to entertainment that keeps them from thinking critically. Both thinkers show that culture has two sides. It teaches, but it also oppresses. It forms us, but it also normalizes us. For culture to truly liberate, we need to stop seeing it as harmony and start seeing it as conflict. To recognize culture as repression is the first step toward freeing ourselves, not by removing all rules, but by consciously creating new ways to live. In Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer take a hard look at modern reason, the very thing that was supposed to free us from superstition, and show how it's turned into a tool of domination. Instead of liberating, reason became a way to control the world and people. What once was critique turned into calculation. Philosophy turned into management. Reason shrank to fit within the limits of efficiency, productivity, and administration. It stopped asking why and focused only on how, no matter the cost. The extreme example, Nazism, with gas chambers organized like industrial operations, cold, calculated rationality without ethics. When reason is stripped of critical thinking and empathy, it becomes complicit in horror. The Frankfurt School doesn't want to throw reason away. They want to rescue it, not just as logic, but as critique, as art, as an ethical force. A reason that asks not only how to do something, but why. Hegel saw art as a powerful way for the spirit to express itself, a way to make universal truths visible. But over time, he believed, art would no longer be enough. Philosophy and religion would go further in expressing human consciousness. Art then fulfills its purpose and outgrows it. That doesn't mean art dies. It just stops being the ultimate way of revealing truth. As our awareness matures, we turn from images to pure reflection. Art becomes aware of its limits, and in that self-awareness, it negates itself as the highest form of truth. Modern art, with its constant experimentation and self-questioning, reflects this. Art no longer claims to hold the whole truth. It breaks itself apart, opens space for uncertainty. Its end is actually a transformation. Art stays alive, but as a broken mirror of truth. Foucault shows that modern power doesn't repress. It creates controlled freedom. Instead of saying no, it sets boundaries and lets you choose within them. We're free to act, but only inside systems shaped by institutions, statistics, and norms. Disciplinary society doesn't rely on physical prisons. It works through everyday routines, habits, and expectations. We're not controlled by force, but by how we've been trained to behave. This kind of freedom is the trickiest trap of all. We think we're autonomous while we just repeat what's expected. Work, consume, behave, perform, all part of the same game. Freedom becomes self-exploitation. Foucault isn't against freedom. He just wants us to question what kind of freedom we really have, and to imagine how we might break free from the invisible cages we mistake for choices. Nietzsche was already skeptical. Truth, presented as sacred, can actually be a tool of domination. So-called universal truths often hide a will to power. Saying, "This is the truth," can be a way of shutting someone up, not understanding them. Derrida takes it further. For him, truth is always shaped by language, and language always involves exclusion, hierarchy, and omission. When truth pretends to be neutral, it can quietly oppress. The violence of truth isn't just in lies. It's in speaking for others, imposing meanings, deciding what can or can't be said. What doesn't fit the norm gets labeled as wrong and erased. But recognizing this doesn't mean everything is meaningless. It means we open space for other voices, other narratives, other truths. Truth should be questioned, not worshipped. Because when truth refuses to be challenged, it's just another form of power with a good reputation. If this content spoke to you in any way, give this video a like. It helps us reach more people who are also searching to live with more awareness. Share it with someone you know needs to hear this today. Sometimes, one sentence can spark real transformation. And of course, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any new reflections. Here, philosophy isn't just decoration. It's a tool for awakening. Thank you so much for being here, for taking time for yourself, and for walking with us on this journey of thought, courage, and self-discovery. See you in the next video. Until then.